Matthew 24, we'll start in verse 9 tonight. We will read down through verse 14, and then we will get after it. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The first word in verse 9 is the word then. This word then is at the beginning, linking verses 9 and 10 to the previous verses that we dealt with last week, 4 through 8. It links the contents of these two verses together, and it speaks of the interim time between the ascension of Christ and 70 AD. So we're dealing with the same period of time tonight that we were dealing with last week. However, what we've done now, Jesus, instead of talking in general about what's going to be going on all over the place, he now zooms in on what's going to be happening to the disciples and the discipleship community. So this is what Christians in this interim period are going to be going through. Here's what's going to be happening, disciples. Remember, he's talking to the disciples. He's letting them know, here's what's going to be happening to you during this period of time. So, I just want to remind us once again, we are not talking tonight, verses 9 through 14, about things that occur at the end of the world. We are dealing with things that will happen to the first century group of believers. AD 33 to AD 70. This interim period of time between the ascension of Jesus and the destruction of the temple. So let's walk through these verses to see what Jesus is going to reveal to them as to what they should expect and what their commission will be during this time period. This first point, I called it tribulation that causes apostasy. Apostasy means a falling away or removing from yourself, proving yourself to be a false believer. Jesus begins his discussion about what will occur, and I just want to say that his purpose for doing so is not to cause discouragement among the disciples. Jesus is not saying, even though a lot of doom and gloom here we're fixing to read about, he's not saying any of this to discourage the disciples or to make things, rough for them. He's actually doing it to encourage them, as we will see. He's not trying to cause them worry. He's trying to fill them with strength and with hope. This power will come, by the way, in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost. This kind of encouragement and hope, this kind of strength will fill them as the third person of the Trinity universally indwells believers at Pentecost. What Jesus does is he gives a fourfold prophecy, if you will, about what events and conditions will occur during the first century discipleship community, during this interim period of time. First is found in verse 9. So fourfold, number one, is found in verse 9. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by nations for my name's sake. The first thing that Jesus tells them is that they will be delivered up. Now here in Matthew, all we're told is that you're going to be hated and killed. That's all we're given. So he's telling the disciples, you are going to be hated and killed. Now, it's interesting because we also have a parallel passage. Mark writes this same story. And in Mark chapter 13 and verse 9, we are told that the disciples would be delivered over, and then listen to what they say, delivered over to councils, beaten in synagogues, stand before governors and kings. So in Matthew, all Matthew records is you're going to be hated and you're going to be killed. Mark records a little bit more information. Jesus also told them that you are going to be beaten, You're going to be arrested. You're going to be brought before councils and synagogues and kings and governors. All right, so that's a bigger picture of what Jesus is saying is going to happen to the disciples. What a thing to know, by the way. You're going to get arrested. You're going to be beaten. You're going to be killed. This is your fate. This is your destiny. What a thing to be told. Now, again, you're sitting there going, and Jesus is saying this to encourage them? This is supposed to be encouraging? We'll get to it, why it is in a minute. Jesus then gives the reason why they will be arrested, beaten, hated, and killed. For my name's sake. So you're going to be arrested. You're going to be beaten. You're going to be hated. You're going to be killed. You're going to stand before kings. You're going to stand before governors. You're going to be brought before councils. You're going to be brought before synagogues. And all of this will be for my name's sake. Now, this statement is probably better understood by the disciples now that they were standing there when Matthew 23 was said. Matthew 23, Jesus looks at all the Jews and just condemns them. I mean, he calls them all kinds of things. He accuses them of all kinds of things. And that's where he ends with saying, I leave this place desolate. Jesus let the Jews have it in Matthew 23. So in Matthew 24, when Jesus says, they're going to hate you for my name's sake, they're going to be like, well, yeah, I bet they're going to hate us. Because if we're going to be teaching and saying the things that you're teaching and saying, why would they not hate us? You just said the temple's going to get destroyed. Of course they're going to hate us. But it's not just the Jews that will hate them, because in Mark's account, Mark says you're going to stand before kings and governors, meaning Gentile kings and governors you're going to stand in front of. So here's the thing. It's not just going to be the Jews that hate you for my name's sake. A bunch of nations are going to hate you for my name's sake. Of course, this makes sense, knowing that the gospel will spread past the Jewish people. So when you preach the gospel to the Jews are going to hate you for my name's sake. When you take the gospel outside of the Jewish people, they're going to hate you for my name's sake as well. Now remember, Jesus is challenging and encouraging them. So in Mark 13:11, Jesus says these words, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say. When you stand before these kings and these governors and these councils and these synagogues, do not be anxious about what you're going to say. But say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now you see where some of the encouragement comes in? Yeah, this is going to happen to you, but the Holy Spirit is going to speak through you. Don't worry about what to say. The Holy Spirit will speak through you. Jesus is telling them that persecution is coming for them and for others after them, but they should stand, speak with boldness, because the Holy Spirit will speak through them. And they should be strong. By the way, Sam Storms gives a reason why it only makes sense to view this as occurring in the interim period between AD 33 and AD 70, because after the temple is destroyed, there are no more councils and synagogues. They're wiped out. They stop. The Jewish system stops at AD 70. So if Jesus is telling the disciples, you're going to stand before councils and synagogues, that must occur before AD 70. Now, we see the fulfillment of all of this in the Bible. The New Testament tells us that the very thing Jesus just said is going to happen. It gets recorded for us, and we read that it happens. For instance, I put these down. We're not going to look them all up. I'm summarizing them for you, but you have them in your notes. Acts 4, 1 through 18, Peter and John were seized, brought before the Jewish council, including the high priest, were charged not to speak about Christ. It is also worthy to note that the council was amazed at their boldness. So there they go, standing before councils. Acts 5, 17 through 40, the apostles were arrested, thrown in prison, but in the middle of the night an angel opened up the doors, and they went into the temple and continued to preach. Acts 12, 1 through 2, Herod laid violent hands on some of the disciples and killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Acts 23, 24, Paul was captured and brought before Felix, the governor. Of course, we know that Jesus' words come true for the disciples because every one of the apostles were martyred except for John before AD 70. So when Jesus says, here's what's going to happen, then the Bible tells us that that very thing happens. So again, we're not talking about the end of the world. We're talking about things the Bible already tells us happens just like Jesus said it was going to happen. The second prophecy, if you will, that Jesus gives them is found in verse 10. It says that many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Now, the reality of verse 10 is caused by the pressure of verse 9. Catch that. The reality of verse 10. Why does verse 10 happen? Why is there a falling away and a hating among one another? Well, because the pressures of verse 9. When persecution comes, or to use the word of Jesus, when tribulation comes, what happens to people? They fall away. Big talkers followed for a little bit. The seed was planted and it grew up. The sun got too hot and it withers. This should not surprise us. When the heat gets turned up and persecution begins, there will be many who will fall away and will not continue to follow Christ. Just like John 6, after Jesus feeds the 5,000, let's double it for the women and children, and let's say Jesus feeds 10,000 people. His followers, by the way, the reason I'm calling them followers is because they were there, they heard him teach, they went across the sea to where Jesus went to meet him on the other side to get more bread. Jesus then spends all of John 6 preaching to them, and when he is done preaching, they all have left saying, your words are too hard, and they leave. Now, if people look like followers can't even stand teaching without falling away, what do you think they're going to do when persecution comes? When Jesus says, here's what's going to happen, what do you think is going to happen to people who are just following on the surface? They're out. They are going to fall away. This is exactly what we read about in the New Testament. I simply am going to read you talk to you about three passages from 1 Timothy. Paul, talking to this young pastor, says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1:15 that all those in Asia Minor have turned away. He says in 4:10, Demas, Crescens, and Titus have abandoned me. 1 Timothy 4:16, Paul says that at his first defense, he was standing before a council, at his first defense, no one stood with me, but all abandoned me. Why? Well, because we don't want to happen to us what's happening to Paul right now. So they abandon. They fall away. Of course, we have John's statement in 1 John 2:19. They went out from us because they were not of us. John would not have written that if there were not people falling away all the time. He felt the need to address Christians and say, there's going to be people falling away. They were never apart to begin with. They were like the people in John 6. They were never apart to begin with. The third prophecy is leading astray. Verse 11. We talked last week about false Christ that would come to prey upon the Jews who were looking for a militant Messiah to come and free them from Rome. Here in verse 11 it says this, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Here it looks like these are not false Christs, but they are imposters within the Christian community who will prey upon people during this period of persecution. Now this makes sense, because if persecution comes, how easily imposters would sneak in and say, you don't have to go through that. Mm-hmm. They soften the gospel a little bit. Soften your message a little bit. You don't have to go through that. The results of their false teaching is that many people will be led astray. R.T. France says that this leading is not just an intellectual error, but a false gospel and a false faith entirely. So it's not just that they get some things wrong. Like the teacher comes in and says, there's this. And they're like, oh, well, okay, and I'm not really sure. And maybe they believe something that's not quite right. These are imposters who are coming in and leading people to a false gospel, leading people astray to a false faith altogether. This is exactly what we read about in the New Testament. One need only to remember that much of what we read in Galatians, Colossians, 2 Corinthians, 2 Timothy, 2 Peter, and 1 John and Jude were all written to counter the activity and influences of false teachers and prophets. So Jesus says there's going to be false teachers and prophets come. And then Paul, in the majority of his letters, has to address all the false prophets and false teaching that are trying to infiltrate the discipleship community. Acts 20:29. Paul warns of fierce wolves that will come after his departure. Romans 16:17 through 19. Paul warns of those who will teach false doctrine, not serving the Lord, but serving themselves. 2 Corinthians 11:13. Paul states that there are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. Galatians 2:4. Paul states that there are false brothers who have secretly made their way into the community to steal freedom. 2 Peter 2:1, Peter warns of false teachers who secretly get in and teach destructive heresies. 1 John 4:1, John tells Christians to test the spirits because false teachers had gone out into the world. Once again, Jesus says, here's what's going to happen. The New Testament affirms that very thing happens. The fourth prophecy, if you will, is the loss of love, found in verse 12. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Here Jesus says lawlessness will increase. Now, in the book of Matthew, the word lawlessness does not simply refer to criminal activity. It does refer to criminal activity, but it's not just talking about criminal activity. It is actually an entire lifestyle which is contrary to the law of God. So it's not just, hey, you're breaking Roman law, you're breaking Jewish law. It is an entire lifestyle being opposed to the law of God. Now, the scribes and Pharisees who prided themselves on their moral behavior, Jesus calls them in Matthew 23:28 lawless. Lawless. Meaning, you're not on the side of God's law. You're lawless men. And because of this lawlessness, love grows cold. Now let me ask you a simple question. Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? It could be said this way. What is the greatest marker of a disciple of Christ? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If we are told that lawlessness abounds and the love of many grow cold, it is impossible for there to be the fire of discipleship and the coldness of love. They cannot go hand in hand. See how this is all tying together? Persecution comes. And what's the result of persecution? People are going to fall away. And they're going to hate one another. They're going to begin backbiting on one another. Oh, I'm not with that group. I'm not with those guys. False prophets are going to see this. What perfect setting and conditions for a false prophet to come in and say, let me teach you a different kind of gospel. Let me teach you a different kind of faith. How easy it will be for there to be a loss of love and lawlessness during this period of time. These four prophecies or statements by Jesus, they all fit together. Notice there's a repetition of a word in these verses. It is the word many. Jesus says many 4 times. Many will be led astray. Many will fall away. The love of many will grow cold. What's he implying? If many fall away, there will be few who stay the course. There will be few who stay the course. Few who actually do what they're supposed to do. This is a time of general decline when it will be a minority of disciples who truly remain faithful. There's going to be this big blow up of the church. The church starts off, it blows up. The gospel's going forth. People are getting saved. People are saying, I'm going to be a part of this thing, this risen Jesus. Then the persecution comes. And what happens to the many? Fall away quickly. Jesus makes it very clear. How will we know who the true disciples are? How can we distinguish between the faithful, the few, and the many? He makes this statement, verse 13. The one who endures to the end will be saved. So when the persecution comes and many are falling away and being led astray and becoming lawless and loveless, the true followers of Christ will endure to the end. The disciples of Christ must have a deliberate and sustained faithfulness all the way to the end. If you do not endure to the end, then they're proof that you are not a true follower and you're not going to be saved. The true follower endures to the end. Now, the end that Jesus mentioned here, we need to talk about this for a minute. Jesus says, the one who perseveres to the end will be saved. Now, is that the end of the temple? Or is that the end of the world? It's neither. Here's why. Who is Jesus talking to? The disciples. How many disciples out of the 12, how many were dead by 70 AD? All except John. Right?
Yeah.
So the end for them was not the temple, nor was it the end of the world. The end of their life. Those who persevere to the end of your life, you will be saved. The word can literally, this end can literally mean right through, all the way, as long as necessary. It's referring to the end of one's life. So when Jesus is telling them that there will be those who suffer persecution, and he's saying, don't fall away. Don't be led astray. Don't let your love grow cold, but endure to the end of your life, and you will be saved. And for each disciple that were hearing these words, that was a different end. They all had a different end at different times. We have a doctrine. Sometimes we say, Baptists like to call it once saved, always saved. Or there was a better term for it before we started using the once saved, always saved. It's called the perseverance of the saint. The perseverance of the saint. Meaning, if you are truly a follower of Christ, there will be ups, there will be downs, you will fall, you will crawl, you will get bloody, beaten, and tattered and torn, but you will persevere all the way to the end of your life. We don't say you're going to persevere to the end, mean persevere to the end of the world. We'll probably all be dead before the end of the world comes. It's not persevering to the end of the world. Just like for the disciples, it wasn't persevering to 70 AD. Most of them were dead. It was persevering unto the end of your life. And Jesus said, that will be the mark of those who truly are my followers. Those who persevere to the end of your life. We now come to the last verse in our text tonight. This is the verse we will spend the most time talking about. It is a verse that has been misunderstood by many. A verse that people have said refers to every single people group in the world receiving the gospel before Jesus comes back. I have heard preachers, evangelists, say something like this. Jesus will not return until every people group gets the gospel and hears the gospel. So will you go and be the one that hastens the day when the Lord returns? Will you be the one to take it to the last people group? And once they hear, the Lord will come back. And they're basing that on this verse. The reason why that is misunderstood is because the end, the gospel must go to the nations, and then the end will come. They're getting what the end is wrong. They're getting what the end is wrong. So therefore, they're misinterpreting what Jesus is meaning here. You've probably heard something similar to that, right? That every people group's going to hear the gospel, and finally, when every people group gets the gospel, Jesus will return. Basically, to say, hey, it's up to you when Jesus comes back. Because if you don't go, then Jesus is just going to wait longer, as if there's not a set day for the second coming of Christ. Now, we have gone into great lengths, especially week 1. We have gone into great lengths to show that what Jesus is referring to in verses 4 through 35. Not the second coming, but the destruction of the temple. Verse 4 through 35, everything in those verses is about the destruction of the temple, not the end of the world. So, the end that is mentioned in verse 14 is the end of the temple, not the end of the world. Now, you will say, well, wait a minute, Neil. That can't be the case. Neil, can you not read verse 14 for yourself? I mean, can you not see that it says that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world? Then the end will come? Neil, the gospel has not been preached to the whole world yet. So I think you're misunderstanding this. Well, I have a guy on my side that I want to introduce you to. His name is Paul. Paul is fixing to tell you that the gospel had already been preached to the world. Let me read you a few verses where Paul says this very thing. Paul, writing before AD 70, writes this in Colossians 1, 5 through 6. Of this you have heard before the word of truth, the gospel, which has come to you, as indeed it has come to the whole world, bearing fruit and growing. You hear what Paul just said? Paul says the gospel has gone to the whole world and is bearing fruit and growing. He writes something very similar in Romans 1:8. In regards to the faith of the Roman church, he says, I thank God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being proclaimed in all of the world. Again, in Romans 10:18, Paul says in regarding the proclamation of the gospel, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Now let me ask you a question. Paul says the gospel has been proclaimed in all the world. Just like Jesus said would occur before the end comes. So Paul, writing before AD 70, says the gospel's been proclaimed all the world. Jesus says what's going to happen before the end comes? The gospel's going to go to the whole world. Paul says it has. Now, Jesus' point is that the gospel will be preached outside of the boundaries of Judea, so that Gentile nations in the inhabited known world would hear the truth of Christ. Over and over again, one of the ways the word world is used in the New Testament is the known inhabited world. Don't think the entire globe. Don't think this means that the gospel has to be preached in America before the end will come. That's not Jesus' point. Jesus' point is the gospel is going to go outside of the boundaries of Judea. What was the commission Jesus gave the disciples? You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and then what did he say? And the uttermost parts of the world. Who did he give that commission to originally? The disciples. So guess what the disciples then are going, what are they going to do? They're going to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. What we like to think is, Jesus gave the commission to the disciples, they did it in Judea and Samaria, and while we're doing it in the uttermost parts of the world. No, the disciples did it in the uttermost parts of the world. Paul did it in the uttermost parts of the world. The known inhabited world of Jesus' day was going to get the gospel before the end would come. Paul then says, I and others have done that very thing. I took the gospel to Greece. I took the gospel to Turkey. I took the gospel outside of the boundaries of Judea. Barnabas, Silas, Luke, others went and proclaimed the gospel outside of the boundaries of Jerusalem and Judea. they took it to the uttermost parts of the world, just as Jesus said would happen. Now, I want to mention a big picture thing in regards to the old temple and the new temple. Remember, in our first lesson, we talked about the new and greater temple coming to replace the old temple, right? We talked about the reasons why this old temple had to fall in AD 70. Why? I mean, we titled the message, "Why Must the Temple Fall?" The reason why the temple had to fall is because there was a new and greater temple ready to take its place. Now, when Jesus ascended into heaven, was that new temple or that new creation, was it ready yet to take the place of the temple? In a degree, but not totally. Why? Because the gospel first had to go to the world. Why? Because this new temple is not just Jewish people. This new temple is Jew and Gentile. It's people from Turkey and people from Greece and people from Rome and people from Jerusalem and it's people all over the world. And so what you have is you have the gospel going to all of these people groups. The new temple is being formed and it's growing and it's thriving. That's what's happening with this new temple. So when the old temple falls, the new and greater temple is ready to step up and take its place. That is why Jesus is saying, before the end comes, the end of this temple comes, the new temple, through the gospel, has to be established. The gospel is going to go to all the world. The new temple and the new creation is going to be made up of Jew and Gentile before this old temple falls. The statement of Jesus is not causational. Jesus is not saying the preaching of the gospel will cause the end to come. It's not what he's saying. It's more chronological or temporal. It's just saying the preaching of the gospel to the world will happen before the end comes. It's not the cause of the end coming. It's simply letting you know, here's what's going to happen before the end comes. And our understanding of the temple makes total sense. Of course, that would need to happen before the temple falls, so that Jew and Gentile alike make up the new temple, the new creation, that then takes the presence of God even further and further and further, until ultimately in Revelation 21, it is all over the face of the globe. R.T. France says it like this: "It is appropriate that the proclamation to all the nations, and thus the gathering of the members of the new and more extensive community, should take place before the old temple is removed." So Jesus' statement in verses 9 through 14 are to encourage the disciples to endure through persecution and to reveal to them that their standing firm is so that the whole world will hear the gospel. Why does Jesus want the disciples to stand firm and not be led astray and not be falling away and not to let their love grow cold? Is because they have a mission to accomplish. Take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. My brothers, take the gospel to the end of the world. And when you do that, the end will come. Once that has occurred, the temple will be destroyed, and the new and greater temple will take its place. It is sitting there, and when the temple falls, what's left is the new temple, made of Jew and Gentile. A new temple. When one falls, there sits the other. Why? Because the gospel had gone to the world. So here's what I want you to understand tonight. Everything Jesus says in verses 9 through 14, the New Testament tells us it's all happened. This isn't something we're waiting to see happen. We can read in the New Testament that it has already happened. Jesus tells them, here's what's going to happen. Then we got the whole New Testament recording that the very things Jesus said was going to happen, happens.